Have you ever felt like you're just going through the motions in your relationship, like you and your partner are just drifting apart? In today's episodes, we're diving into one of the most dangerous traps that couples will fall into, withdrawal. We'll uncover how this losing strategy can slowly destroy connection and why pulling away, whether physically or emotionally, comes at a huge cost to your relationship. But don't worry, we're not going to leave you just hanging there. As always, we're going to give you the tools and strategies to help you regain that closeness that you crave. So buckle up. Let's dive into the next episode of Master Your Marriage.
Welcome to another episode of Master Your Marriage. Today is our final episode in our series on losing relationship strategies. And as a reminder, all of these strategies are based on the work of Dr. Terry Real, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, and also Drs. John and Julie Gottman. And the seventh and final losing strategy in this series is withdrawal. And before we begin, I just want to make a suggestion to you guys today. We always jam pack a lot of valuable information and tools into each of these episodes. And so if you're struck by something that we share today, may I suggest that you hit the pause button as you're listening and then just verbally explain out loud what you just heard. This is such a powerful learning hack that helps us to be able to internalize that information that we just heard so that we can remember it and we can recall it again later when we need it.
Yeah, that's such a good tool just to be able to verbalize it because it comes from your head, out of your mouth, and you see it, hear it, and say it one more time.
And say it in your own words, then it really reinforces it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now on to talking about withdrawal. Like any of the other losing strategies, withdrawal can take many forms. It shows up in various shapes and sizes, and we'll explore several examples in this episode. But the main similarity between the different types of withdrawal is simple. It's the way we disinvest from the relationship. And we usually do it when we're not getting what we want. Whether we realize it or not, withdrawal can really also be another way to try and control your partner. In fact, of all the losing strategies that we discussed over the last several weeks, they all fall into one of three categories. One, pressuring your partner to conform to be what we want them to be.
That's number one.
Two, yielding to the form our partner wants us to take, such as resentful accommodation.
I'll be who you want me to be. Just love me.
Yeah, just love me. Or three, disengaging and disinvesting.
Which is what we're talking about today.
Yes.
So all these losing strategies fit into one of those, or sometimes more than one of those categories. And withdrawal is, again, disengaging from the marriage or the relationship. It's giving up. It's when we stop trying to influence the relationship or make it better. And, it's interesting when couples come to coaching, and when they're on the brink of divorce, you can usually tell right away which one of the partners doesn't want to be there. It's not difficult to map it and see which partner is just going through the motions just to make it look like, oh, I tried. But in reality, they don't want the marriage anymore. They don't want to be there.
So let's talk about what withdrawal looks like. And we're going to look at it on the extreme end of the spectrum. And its most extreme, withdrawal becomes apathy. And that's really dangerous. So apathy is complete resignation. And it begins this sort of crushing loneliness for both of the partners. If you remember John Gottman, the researcher we've mentioned, who could predict divorce with 90% accuracy, well, after observing thousands of couples, he identified the chain of events that often leads to the couple's separation. He calls this chain of events the distance isolation cascade.
So this chain of events begins with flooding, and then that leads into more criticism, more character attacks, more insults, contempt, defensiveness, basically all these things that we've been talking about over the last several weeks, which are just the ways we poorly manage conflict.
Yeah.
And over time, it causes the couple to start to think like, oh, our problems must be insurmountable. And as a result, they start to withdraw more and more. They may just stop sharing their concerns and their opinions with each other. Their communication might it might be limited to like the daily mundane details, like what's the kid's schedule or what's going on with the dog or who did the laundry, right? And as this cascade continues, couples end up living separate but parallel lives. In fact, they often even start deliberately scheduling their schedules away from each other so that they can minimize contact as much as possible. Eventually, their lives run on parallel tracks with as little interaction as possible. And this is where that crushing loneliness sets in. And that ends up becoming so unbearable that the couple ends up deciding to call it quits.
Yeah. It usually starts with, sometimes people will say we have the roommate syndrome.
Right.
Where we're just roommates, but
That's
our lives are no longer intertwined. They're really just disinvested.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. We've had many of our clients tell us, John or whoever their partner is, John and I started leading, just more separate lives. He had his interests. I had mine. He had his friends. I had my friends. And eventually there just wasn't simply that much to kind of bind us together anymore.
We just grew apart.
Yeah. We
just grew apart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So many couples believe that this is just something that is bound to happen to them in the future, but it's the direct result of all of the losing strategies that we've covered. It's not by accident at all. This happens when couples fail to address the patterns that we've discussed in this series, such as control, the need to be right, unbridled self-expression, some defensiveness, maybe throwing a little contempt and some resentful accommodation in there. And when these patterns go unchecked for years, they lead to the greatest form of withdrawal, which is living these separate but parallel lives.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? A lot of people think that the opposite of love is hate. But I've
heard that, right?
Right. But actually the opposite of love is apathy. When someone is angry or critical of their partner, what's interesting is they're actually still trying to make some sort of change in their partner, or maybe they're just trying to make their partner suffer a little bit, right?
It could be suffering, yeah.
But even that, oddly enough, that's actually more hopeful for a marriage than when someone has emotionally left the relationship. When you are extremely withdrawn, you don't even care if your partner suffers. You don't care if they feel pain. It's just not even worth your energy. At least when you want to make someone suffer, you're still engaged in the relationship on some level, which is sad, but it's interesting to think about because apathy is the opposite, and apathy is far more concerning for a relationship because that represents disinvestment.
Yeah. And this total disengagement is the extreme form of withdrawal. But there are also smaller, more subtle ways to disengage or divest or disinvest from the relationship. Withdrawal can sometimes look like maybe storming out of the room in the middle of a conflict.
Yeah, that's one way.
Right? Maybe a gradual, slow decline in frequency of lovemaking, or maybe avoidance. And this could stem from, a fear of conflict, a mistrust of intimacy, or an aversion to any vulnerability.
Right. That's another way we withdraw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then stonewalling, which is another form of withdrawing, but it's really where we're shutting down during conflict. Guys tend to be really good at that part.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that. So you can also withdraw from parts of the relationship or the entire relationship. So for example, you might just stop sharing your feelings. You might stop sharing, your thoughts about a particular issue. You might stop trying to improve your sexual relationship by withdrawing yourself physically. You can also withdraw by tiptoeing around your partner's volatility, either thinking that maybe your partner is too fragile to handle a truth or too explosive to handle certain issues. That's a really common one. I recently worked with a couple that was deep into withdrawal. They both really loved this strategy. She would withdraw by physically kind of removing herself from all types of physical intimacy. And he was withdrawing by making sure he was tiptoeing around her and avoiding stressful conversations that he didn't think she could emotionally handle, which ironically led to her withdrawing even more. So it became this really vicious cycle.
Yeah, because when one person senses a withdrawal, then it starts to happen on both sides.
And you start to feel lack of trust.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of different ways, big and small, that we can do withdrawal.
Yeah. So you can also withdraw from certain types or specific conversations, like discussing money, like, oh no, I don't want to do that, or parenting, because you feel like those conversations, maybe you don't feel like they get you anywhere. So why bother?
Right.
These are some of the sneakier, more subtle ways that withdrawal creeps into all of our relationships, and honestly, including ours. And we're right there with you. We recently had to address a withdrawal pattern in our relationship, even after catching ourselves doing it.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I don't think we have time to get into that whole conversation too much today, but Robert and I just recently, a few weeks ago, were talking about a specific concern. And I got the sense that he was a little bit withdrawn and wasn't necessarily all that into the conversation with me. And so I just asked him, I'm like, hey, are we doing that thing where, you kind of like to withdraw from this conversation? And he was like, yeah, I am. And he explained why. He explained that he didn't really feel like he had a voice in that particular matter, to which I was interested in learning more. I was interested in like, okay, well, what are your concerns? Like, let's work through this, because right now it's a small issue, but we know that if we ignore these small issues, they become really big issues.
Yeah. I mean, you can start by withdrawing from one facet of the conversations or the relationship, and then that can then just start to expand. And
so the point in bringing that up is that we struggle just like everyone else. These aren't patterns that, just because you always know better doesn't mean you're always perfect. And we all have kind of our natural man, our tendencies that we tend to go back to. And so we have to kind of be self-assessing all the time. And that's why it's so important to know these patterns, so that when you see it, you can pivot quickly and repair early and often when these things do creep back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this is a really important question. I think this is $1 million question to think about. What is the difference between withdrawal and mature acceptance?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right? Think about this. Sometimes we deceive ourselves into thinking that avoiding conflict is acceptance, and therefore I'm good for doing it. I'm virtuous in some way for stepping out and withdrawing in this way.
Right.
After all, like, no relationship is perfect. We all do have conflict and nobody gets their way all of the time. But what is the difference between withdrawal and mature acceptance? Because they're definitely not the same thing. And when we confuse the two, it can lead to big trouble in the relationship.
Yeah. So, let's think about that. So the difference is that real acceptance is choice-based. Choice. So we chose it instead of the opposite, where we've just ignored it
and resentfully gone along with it.
So in a mature relationship, when it becomes clear that maybe one of your particular needs won't be fully met, you sort of reach this place of reckoning. Like, okay, now I have a decision to make, right? And Dr. Terry Real frames this reckoning as follows. He asks, so are enough of my needs being met in this relationship to make grieving for the loss of what I still have to give up worth it?
Right. So, is it worth it?
Yeah.
Is there enough good here that I'm willing to maybe give up a couple of things? And can I find acceptance around that? So in his book, The New Rules of Marriage, Dr. Terry Real actually shares a story that illustrates this really well. So we want to share that story with you today. And it's a story about Phyllis and Doug. And like many women, actually 1 in 4 women, Phyllis had a history of sexual abuse starting at the age of 7.
Ooh.
And Doug knew this going into it. He understood the trauma and understood that it had left a significant impact on her. And Phyllis had, for her entire life, had this really complicated relationship with sex. There were periods in her life of hypersexuality, but also as she became closer to men and closer in her connection with Doug, that she would start to shut down sexually.
With her therapist's encouragement, Phyllis started to experiment with ways to maintain control in the bedroom. She took charge of when, what, and where, and she initiated sex, and she experimented with different ways to arouse Doug as well, and even tried tying him to the bedposts. Phyllis stayed in control as a way to reassure her that the sexual situation was safe.
Right. And that then allowed Phyllis to be able to relax. And over time, they were able to restore their sex life. But Phyllis could never fully relax enough to be able to hand over equal control to Doug in the bedroom. And so for Doug, this was really a challenge because he would sometimes fantasize about being in control. And sometimes he wanted to have that opportunity to ravish his wife, right? But Phyllis was too traumatized to be able to distinguish between being ravished and being assaulted. And if Doug came across even the least bit aggressive, of course, that would trigger her.
So Phyllis did all she could to sort of heal her trauma. But the truth was, she could never really be the type of woman who could fully and unequivocally surrender to Doug. And if Doug couldn't accept that, he would then have to reconsider his relationship with Phyllis. So How did he feel about these limitations? Well, probably bad.
He felt
He didn't
bad.
feel great about it, but not as bad as he would have felt if he lost the woman that he loved. So we're starting to see the compromise here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also not as bad as he would if he felt like he had to continue to pressure Phyllis beyond her limits,
Right.
beyond what she was comfortable with.
Exactly. So then Doug, of course, had to ask himself a question.
That question.
That same question Robert just asked, is there enough for me in this marriage to Phyllis to make grieving the loss of a totally uninhibited sexual partner still worth it? Is it still worth it? And so Doug had to make a conscious choice that he wasn't going to be a victim and he wasn't going to complain about it. He was going to tolerate that little bit of disappointment and focus on all the good, focus on being grateful for all the other ways that Phyllis enriched his life, even if their sex life was going to end up being a little bit unconventional, right? So that's what true acceptance is. It's the cultivation of gratitude rather than letting that resentment continue to just fester.
So I like that. It's the cultivation of gratitude rather than the
resentment.
Cultivation of gratitude rather than the growth of resentment. Well, when you reflect on the areas where you may be withdrawing in your relationship, you have to sort of be honest with yourself. If you feel hurt or angry or frustrated or resentful, that's not acceptance. And if you have genuine attitude of gratitude, then you're growing in acceptance. Here's the number one rule to follow when it comes to withdrawal. The difference between acceptance and withdrawal is the presence of resentment.
There you go. There's one more nuance to talk about when it comes to withdrawal, and that is what is responsible distance taking? Is it okay to take a break? What does a healthy break look like, right? Because just as there is a significant difference between withdrawal and acceptance, there's also a crucial difference between unhealthy withdrawal and a healthy need for space. So let's go back to, and let's look at Dr. John Gottman's research again. So one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse that he called it was stonewalling, if you remember. And stonewalling occurs when one person in a conversation or an argument withdraws from the interaction and shuts down. Okay, is this a problem? Yes. Dr. John Gottman found in his research that 80% of the time, men were actually the ones doing the stonewalling. And probably even more interestingly, he found that stonewalling almost always happened the moment an individual's heart rate hit around 100 beats per minute.
So they're flooded.
They're flooded, indicating that their body was going into fight or flight mode. And Dr. John Gottman referred to this state that couples would go into as diffuse physiological arousal, or DPA.
And when this happens, the couples definitely needs to take a break.
Yes.
Otherwise, they're likely to say or do something that they'll regret later. When fight or flight kicks in, we're not able to be compassionate. We can't truly hear each other. We can't process new information. We make poor decisions. And we advise couples to have a plan for how to advance or how to move forward when it's time to take a break. And even we like to suggest that they have a code word or a signal for when they need this break to occur.
So what you're saying is it's a good idea to take a break and to withdraw for a moment in these situations.
Yeah.
So that would be healthy distance taking.
That's healthy distancing. We're not talking about withdrawing. We're talking about distancing.
Healthy.
In a very specific situation.
Right. So we'll give you some rules for that in a second.
Yep.
There are other times when couples need to take a break, even when it's not getting heated. Real relationships are an ongoing negotiation between closeness and distance, right? And sometimes both can be important. Sometimes we feel overwhelmed or we need rest. Sometimes we need to go for a walk or take a bath. But there are responsible ways to take distance. And again, there's irresponsible ways to take distance.
Yeah. And I think that, we're going to talk about that, but I think that if you don't have a plan, this is just my thought here. If you don't have a plan, you can leave hurt feelings on the other side.
Absolutely.
Especially when they don't know what's going on. That's why it's important. So the irresponsible way to take distance is this one-sided unilateral decision made without respectfully communicating your needs. Often it's storming out of the room or just going completely silent. Now, that's sort of what I was talking about. And that is not productive.
Right.
Right. When we need a break, we need to do it responsibly, which means both people agree and have a clear understanding of what the break entails.
Yeah. So here comes the second rule to follow when it comes to withdrawal. Responsible distance taking always includes two elements. So what are these two elements? The first one is an understanding, right? They have to have an understanding. So for example, I'm starting to feel flooded. I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. And they know ahead of time that means I need to take a break. So I need to take a break right now because I'm feeling flooded. Or maybe they just are tired, exhausted. And the one person says, hey, I need to rest right now. I'm going to go unwind in the bath for 30 minutes. So the first element is an understanding. What's the second element?
So the second element is this promise to return. For example, can we, you might say, can we pick this up in an hour?
Yes.
Rather than just storming out of the room during a fight. You get to call a timeout. You get to let your partner that you're going to go cool off and that you'll be back in an agreed specified time frame.
That's key.
It's super important
right
there.
So responsible leave taking a break, that's totally okay, as long as it has those two elements, that there's an understanding of what it means, and secondly, that there's an agreed upon time and that we come back.
Yeah. We like the code word. There's a couple that we ran into. And if they're listening, this is the one that you shared with us. Carrots
was their code word.
Carrots was their code word. Just like they just throw carrots in as in the middle of a conversation. Like, I don't know, carrots. Like, okay. Yeah. I thought it was really cute. So
there are appropriate times, and those are some of the examples, but otherwise we want to really steer clear of withdrawal.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that concludes our discussion on these losing strategies. And the reason, though, that these are losing strategies, we call them losing strategies, is because none of these strategies actually help us to get what we want. They don't lead us to feeling more understood or heard or loved. In fact, withdrawal is probably the most blatant example of this, because clearly you can't get more of your needs met by withdrawing from the relationship, can you?
Yeah. And the cost of withdrawal is significant.
Yeah.
It essentially communicates to the partner that you're really not even worth my time or energy to fight over anymore. And this is a very, very slippery slope, leading couples down a path of resentment, disengagement, loneliness, and heartache.
Yeah. So here's what we want to suggest to you today. If you are carrying even a shred of resentment towards your partner, take ownership of that. Take responsibility to either reach a place of acceptance, like we talked about, through exercising gratitude, or get back to the negotiation table with your partner. Express your needs in a constructive way, not by being a martyr, not by resentfully accommodating under the guise of compromise, but by truthfully, honestly expressing your needs. And we did a whole 4-part series on this, right?
Yeah,
where we talked about how to effectively communicate your needs.
Yeah.
And that was back in episodes 57, 58, 59, and 60, I believe. So you can always go back and listen to that as a guide to help you to be able to express your needs more effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. So now it's time for self-assessment. And with all of these strategies in mind, I want you to consider, what is your favorite losing strategy profile?
Oh, I have some favorites.
Okay. We all have our own unique blend of losing strategies, and your profile might be 30% needing to be right, 50% of this unbridled self-expression, dashed with a little bit of 20% retaliation. Right? Or maybe you have a 2-step strategy, such as moving first into resentful accommodation. And then when that fails, then you just, you play the victim and go straight into withdrawal.
Yeah.
So you got to ask yourself, what is your favorite flavor of a losing strategy?
And you know what? You don't have to get super precise here, but just getting an idea of what your tendencies are when pressures arise in your relationship, that can be so helpful, because when you know better, you can start to do better.
Yeah.
You can catch yourself early, like we did just recently. You can catch yourself early, often repair quickly, and start to interrupt more and more and more of those patterns in yourself.
Absolutely. All right. So let's wrap up with some final journaling questions on losing strategies. Question number 1. Which losing strategies do you favor?
What's your favorite flavor?
What's your favorite flavor of a losing strategy? 2, where did I learn these losing strategies? And then who did I see using them as I grew up?
Okay.
Yep.
And then in your opinion, which does your partner use? What's your partner's favorite losing strategy?
Yeah.
And how might your losing strategies be used by your spouse to justify their own losing strategies? That's an interesting question.
Absolutely.
Now, what I want you to do with this is take these observations about yourself and go talk to your partner about it. Go talk to them about yourself, not about the observations you've made about them, but go talk to your partner about the observations you've made in you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We're grateful for every one of you. And we kindly ask, if you haven't yet, please leave a comment and a 5-star review. It really helps us make a greater impact on couples. And if you know anyone who this episode might help, please consider sharing it.
Of course, be kind to each other this week. Take care of each other. Remember, it's the small things done often that makes the biggest impact.